Paper Cut Club on Oman FM.
Hello and welcome to the Paper Cut Club, a show where we discover a little bit more about the world and ourselves through the magic of the written word. I'm your host, Fatma Makki, and today it's just me in the studio with our producer, Abdullah Al Maawali.
Hey.
Hi.
Hi.
Abdullah, one of the things that I love the most about reading is being able to escape into other worlds, other countries, other cultures, and other families.
What's wrong with your world?
Wait, we're not doing a therapy session today. Don't catch me by surprise.
Okay, my bad. Go on.
But actually, this might end up being a therapy session because this is an episode about families.
Okay.
Families are such an interesting topic in general, and one that is obviously portrayed endlessly in literature. So I thought it would be definitely worth it to dedicate this episode to traveling around the world with 5 families.
Nice. Where are we going?
Let's see. We're going to Korea/Japan. We're going to Iran, India, America, and Chile.
Okay, those are cool places. Why did you bundle Korea and Japan together? Because I feel like they historically don't like each other too much.
Well, yes, and that came about as a result of Japan's colonization of Korea, which is why it's impossible to separate them in this particular story, and you'll find out why. But before we do that, I want to just explain a little bit the term family saga. Because first of all, I never really hear of the word saga without the word family attached to it. I've done a little bit of research to see if there's a specific definition. And in a way, yes, there is. It's very vague and it's not like prescriptive. But essentially, a family saga is a novel that explores relationship dynamics as a central theme of the novel, within a family, of course. Usually it features different generations of a family. I mean, it's quite necessary to feature different generations of a family, either across time or within a specific period of time. So like grandparents, parents, children, all that stuff.
Is it usually fiction or non-fiction?
Well, if it was non-fiction, I think it would be more autobiographical.
Okay.
Or biographical, I would say. I've never read, actually, a saga that was non-fiction.
So generally, this category applies to fiction?
Fiction, yes.
Okay.
And oftentimes it's tied with historical fiction. As you'll see in this list, one of the things that I noticed is that a lot of these novels are also classified as historical fictions. And there is a theme that sort of reoccurs, or a trend, a pattern, and I want to know if you will be able to pick it up, so I won't say what it is.
All right.
Oftentimes, these novels feel sort of sweeping and epic in scope, but at the same time very intimate because of the fact that it deals with individual family members. And to me, it's endlessly fascinating to read about families, and I think a lot of other people find that as well. I don't know, I mean, do you feel in movies and in popular culture, whatever you like to consume, do you find yourself drawn to stories about families?
Yeah, I do, actually. It's very interesting to see how other families operate compared to mine. I never felt like I come from what we consider a traditional type of family. To see how other families operate is always fascinating. Yeah, but I never considered, I'd say, like other cultures, like Japanese and Korean culture. So
Yeah.
I'm very interested to hear.
I mean, one of the things that struck me the most is that when you do look at families around the world in literature, you would expect to be more separate, like focus more on the differences, but you always end up getting this feeling of, wow, families really are very similar in a lot of ways. Like the things that I struggle with or that I enjoy about my family are things that would exist in the United States or in Korea or, you know, in any of these countries that are being featured today.
Okay.
And I was going to include one very famous family saga in this list, but I decided at the last minute not to.
What was that?
It's the story of Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy, which is probably one of the sort of quintessential modern classic examples of a family saga.
Okay.
And it's so much a family saga that the opening line is one of the most famous lines about families in the world, probably. One of the most recognizable lines. Happy families are all alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Interesting.
Yes.
Is that true?
Well, I think it's true for literature, if you think about it, or for art.
Okay.
If you think about it, people are not interested in just seeing happiness.
Yeah, boring.
I know that sounds really dark.
Boring.
They don't want to, like, as me and my mom, we have an inside joke about al-usra sa'ida. You know, it's like the happy family that you see in Iqra books and stuff, you know. Al-usra sa'ida, you know. It's really hard to explain the context that we use it in because it's just one of those things, you know. But like, it's sort of become this term to refer to like boring people, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. Imagine you watch an entire movie where everyone's happy from beginning till end.
You would just, yes.
Maybe
exactly.
maybe in today's context, that would be actually interesting.
Yeah, it would be like refreshing and
It's
foreign.
like no conflict.
Who are these humans?
Hello, mother.
Actually, if you think about it, all stories where the humans turn out to be like aliens, secretly aliens, are always like weirdly happy families, like the Stepford Wives or whatever,
Right.
you know?
Yeah.
So it just shows you that like families are sort of have this conflict built into the structure where you have like, you know, the parents and then the children.
Makes sense because we're talking about this individuals who didn't choose each other.
Exactly.
You know, and you're just forced to live in the same house.
Exactly. And some have power and authority over others. Others need to be subservient. But the point where they need to be subservient, i.e. the children, that's when they're at their most energetic and rebellious. So there's just like conflict built into it.
Yeah.
It's the perfect scene to start a novel with, you
Right.
know? So with that, we're gonna go around the world, starting with Korea, Japan. Our first stop is Korea/Japan with the novel Pachinko by Min Jin Lee. Pachinko follows the lives of one poor family from a very small island in Korea at the start of the 20th century. At the head of this family is a widow named Sunja, who has now been made to bear the economic burden of keeping her family clothed and fed during a very difficult economic period for the island and for the nation. This is during a time of Japanese colonial rule, which is where Japan comes in to the story. And this colonial rule has a deep, deep impact on the family in many ways. They're forced to eventually leave their island due to the conflicts, which are the conflicts that precede World War II, and they are resettled to Osaka in Japan. So this story follows the lives of Sunja and how much she struggled to keep her family alive and to raise her family well, her children. And it goes through the lives of her children, her grandchildren, and the emergence of modern South Korea, as well as the creation of North Korea, which is something I didn't really know anything about. But what is left behind with this is a really detailed portrait of the family, but also of the spirit of those times, of what it was like to be Korean during Japanese rule, what it was like to face that level of discrimination and sort of oppression, and how they came out of it at the end, and all of the baggage that is left behind from such a colonial history. So for me, I had really limited knowledge of Korea and Japan's history. I didn't know anything, honestly. It's embarrassing to say. I didn't really know anything about Japan's involvement with Korea, about how North Korea even came to exist.
Well, I guess I'm embarrassed now because I don't know still.
Well, even if you don't want to read the book, and something that probably most people will be happy to hear, and I'm very happy to hear, is that this is going to be a new show. I've actually mentioned it on a previous episode, but this is going to be turned into a new TV show on Apple TV. And you can come over and watch it. I have Apple TV. I specifically got it for this reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Because I am so excited. It's going to be actually in March, so not that far off soon.
We are in March.
Yeah, we're in March.
Congratulations,
Yay.
March 2nd.
Yay. And so we're gonna be able to see it on the screen, which I think is amazing.
Is it a series or a movie?
It's a series.
Okay.
So it's gonna be like kind of like a K-drama.
Okay.
And I'm not into Korean shows and things like that, but a lot of the people who I read this, and actually this was the first book we read as a book club with the paper cut.
Oh.
I forgot to mention that. And a lot of the people who read it, who are interested in Korean dramas, said that it had that feeling of a K-drama in a sense, because there was a lot of like love interests and, stuff about betrayal and family and all of that. And yeah, it was really interesting. I got to see a side of Korean culture that I never would have been able to understand, without reading this book. And
do you have any examples of that?
Well, maybe this is the best example that comes to mind. It's a little bit dark, but it's actually one that is based on a true story. So one of the great things about this book is that it was extremely well researched by Min Jin Lee, the author. She's a Korean American, so she had to spend a lot of time, I think, in Korea researching. And one of the stories she came across, which deeply moved her, so much so that she decided to put it in the story in a slightly fictionalized manner, was a story about this young boy who was around 11 years old, and he was a Korean boy living in Japan. So he was of Korean heritage, I should say. So he was Japanese, but he had Korean heritage. And people with that ethnic mix in Japan, they were at least very discriminated against previously. And they had a separate name for them, which translates to foreigners. So children would be bullied in school for having Korean, backgrounds and things like that. One child was bullied so badly that he actually commits suicide. Oof. And he was only 11 years old. And this obviously was a story that shocked, the nation. And it really highlighted how bad the discrimination had gotten to the point that it would lead a child to do something like this. And the story goes deeper than the headline, in the novel. And it goes to the family, the parents of this child. And we learn a little bit more about how isolating it can be to be a young Korean person in that period of time and the effects that it has on their mental health. Another thing as well is like the relationship between parents and children. So Sunja, the mother, she had a very complicated relationship with her children because she had two children, and her relationship with both of them was very, well, I can't really explain more without going into too much detail, but it was very complex. And it was very endearing and charming, actually, in a way. It wasn't what you would typically expect. Maybe people might have a sort of stereotypical image of what a Korean family might be like, with like themes of honor and, obedience and things like that. And yes, there are elements of that in, but it's so much more complicated than just those headlines, let's just say. So I really love this novel. I think that if you have an interest in family sagas, this is definitely one that you want to be reading.
And in the Korean culture.
In Korean culture, definitely. Yeah. Like the friends who read the book, who were already interested in Korean culture, Korean drama and stuff like that, they loved it. And I didn't have that background. Like I don't have those hobbies, but I could not put this book down. Like I read it in 3 days, 4 days. It's like 600, 700 pages. Whoa. And I couldn't put it down. It was gripping, literally, and I was sobbing towards the end. Wow. Which I know, like, people who read books, they say that and they make it sound like it's a good thing. It somehow is a good thing. I was so touched by it that I was crying like crazy, Okay,
personal rating?
Ooh, okay, personal rating, I would give it a 4.5 out of 5.
Ooh.
Yeah, it was really excellent. The only reason why I gave it a half point less than 5 is because there was some issues with like the way the story was paced. Like there was some periods where like a very small time of like a couple of months would be stretched out across a very long section of the book, and then another section where like decades would pass suddenly, and you're like, wait, I need more.
Like, nothing important happened.
Yeah, just decades went by, So that was the only issue that I had, but it's minor in comparison with everything that I got out of it. Our next stop is Iran. Can you think of any books or movies set in or about Iran by Iranians?
Movie The Separation, I remember.
Oh, I haven't seen that one.
That was really good.
That was an Oscar winner, wasn't it? Or nominated at least.
I'm not sure, but I watched a couple of Iranian films, and what I noticed they have in common is the lack of background music. It's very reliant on just recorded sound, just sound.
Wow.
And like, you know, in American films, once the tension starts to build up, the music starts to build up with it. And when done well, it really amplifies the emotion.
Right.
But with a lot of the Iranian films that I watch, it's dry, like dry in a good way.
Wow.
I really enjoy it. It feels very real when there's no music to tell you how to feel.
Yes.
And it's very human-centric, even if it has a nice plot. It's very human, very drama-heavy. You know? Yeah, A Separation was a good one.
Oh, I'll put that down to watch. I have to say, I haven't read much from Iran. I've read maybe a few, 3-4 books. And this one is definitely my favorite. It's called My Uncle Napoleon by Iraj Pesheskzad. His name is a little bit of a tongue twister. This book was gifted to me actually by one of my best friends, who's also from Iran. Her name is Yasi. And it quickly became one of my favorite books, maybe of all time, I would say. And I will never not plug it. It was written in the 1920s, I believe, or at least it was set during that time. It was set during the 1920s. And it follows this family, a very formerly wealthy and noble family in Tehran, through the eyes of its young narrator, who's unnamed, and we kind of know him as Majnoon Layla. Okay? Because it, you know, obviously in Arabic poetic tradition, there's this story of Majnoon Layla, who is a poet who falls crazily in love with this woman called Layla, and he renames himself Majnoon Layla because he doesn't have a name anymore. He's just crazy about Layla.
That's creepy.
Yeah. So, you know, this young narrator, he's like 10 or 11 years old, and he discovers his first love, who's actually his neighbor and also his cousin, her name is Layli, okay? And he's so madly in love with her that the story follows like his inner thoughts as he, you know, goes and takes a peek at her and gets really nervous around her and tries to figure out how he's gonna propose to her. And, you know, it's really sweet and funny in that way. It's also very clever because he's not only observing her, but he's observing his whole crazy family. So the two families, you know, live next door to each other, his house and his uncle's house. And his uncle is nicknamed Napoleon because he is, for some reason, obsessed with Napoleon, the military leader of France. And he just keeps on, you know, admiring Napoleon and relating himself to Napoleon. Like, he sees himself in a way as Napoleon. Because he used to be in the army, in the Iranian army in the past, and he really wants to hold on to that former glory of his. Although, as the book progresses, you start to get the sense that maybe that was a little bit exaggerated or almost probably completely fabricated. That former glory of his as being, you know, in the army. And he always talks about how this one particular heroic battle that he fought, which as time goes by, you start to think, actually, I think he's lying. And what I love about this book is that it's what they call a comedy of errors. So it's a lot of crazy slapstick scenes that it's not necessarily about the plot per se. Actually, the plot is very inconsequential. What's really interesting is that it's just a number of scenes that follow each other that just highlight either the absurdity of certain types of family dynamics or the absurdity of certain aspects of politics, because it was also a very political novel in its own way. It's a satire. So it looks on the outwardly to be very lighthearted, but when you really sit down and examine it, it's actually quite deep and profound and makes a lot of political statements, which is a very common technique that's used in countries where artists want to express certain views and they don't necessarily want to be very blatant about that expression.
Right.
So I really love this book. It made me laugh out loud. So if people who read more Western centric novels come to this book, they need to sort of just keep in mind that this is its own form of Middle Eastern novel. It doesn't really follow the
Structure?
The structure, yes, it's more like scenes. It's just scenes one after another. As I said, it might feel like even repetitive to the point where it's like, why do I need this many scenes? What is the point of this? The point is to entertain and for each scene, I think, to be viewed on its own. And actually, this was turned into a mini-series, and only in Iran in the 70s. And apparently it was very, very famous. The book was very controversial in some ways, but it was, I think, a cult sort of favorite of Irani society. And I just want to read out a little quote to give you an idea of the sense of humor of the story and the main character's sort of innocent view of life.
Okay.
So in this scene, I'll just read it, you'll understand. Mm-hmm. I stole a small coin from my mother's bag and, with the excuse that I was going to buy a notebook, went off to the covered bazaar. I bought a candle and lit it at the drinking fountain at the bazaar. Oh God, first forgive me for lighting a candle with stolen money. Second, either help me solve the argument between my father and dear uncle, or you solve it. But I was certain that if God wanted to help, he would choose the second of these two ways of solving the problem. I knew this and only said the first way out of politeness. And anyway, as a priority, I asked God to find the lost Dustali.
What's that?
Dustali is someone who was missing, basically, from the family. So this just sort of gives you an idea of the tone. Like, he's just a very precocious young boy. He's not the most reliable of narrators as well, which is another common feature of Middle Eastern novels. And I really enjoyed it because it was a book about an Iranian family, just living their lives. And it's funny, they're very dysfunctional. They've got their quirks, but it's not about, them being oppressed or, all the typical things that you immediately think of when you start thinking of, an Irani drama or an Irani novel, you know? So I really like that. I think we need more of that. So I want to plug this book as much as possible. I think that it shows a side of Iran that most people never see,
Personal rating?
Oh, this one's a 5 out of 5.
Ooh.
Yes.
Is that even a thing?
Yes.
You can call things 5 out of 5? I didn't think that was possible.
But it's a very personal rating, I think, because I've never, even though it's not about an Arab family, this is probably the most I've ever related to a family in literature or to characters.
Okay.
Because of the religious aspects of the story. Like, I've never seen religion portrayed in this way. That's so close to the way our family practices, And it talks about like stuff about Shia traditions and things like that I've never seen discussed again in a humorous way, So for me, it was such a refreshing thing to read. The name of the book is My Uncle Napoleon by Iraj Pesheshgzad. Next stop is India.
India.
In Oman, we're very mixed with Indian society. There's a lot of Indian culture that's affected society here and culture
Food,
here.
particularly.
Food, so much. But this is probably the most in-depth look at Indian family dynamics, or at least one aspect of it that I've ever seen. And this is from the book The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. I've also mentioned this book in the past, and it's worth mentioning again. It's probably one of the greatest examples of a well-written family saga that I've ever had. It follows the stories of fraternal twins, Rahel and Esta, whose lives are completely destroyed by what is referred to in the books as the love laws of India. So I think the love laws is an expression that the writer coined herself for this book, but it's a really handy term to refer to a very complicated set of social rules based on religion and culture in India, which tells people who they can marry, who they can love, how much they can love them, things like that.
It's like arranged marriages and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And also the very, this is all complicated much more so by the fact that there's a caste system within the Hindu religion, and that has a huge impact on the way that people, get married and form relationships.
What does a caste system mean?
And this was my first introduction to the caste system in India, which is basically that within the Hindu religion, they have these different levels of people, essentially, and it's like a socioeconomic class almost. I mean, it ends up becoming their socioeconomic class. So,
Okay.
at the top of the caste is Brahmin, who are a caste of people who are more favored spiritually, and they have more rights and more privileges. And then it goes all the way down to the untouchables, which is a
Wow.
separate caste. Yes, they're literally referred to as the untouchables. And it's this lowest class within the Hindu caste system. And
The untouchables is the lowest class, but they're the untouchables.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Actually, now that you say that, yes. But they're untouchable because of the fact that they're not necessarily rejected from society, but maybe, I don't want to say the wrong thing here.
Okay, yeah.
But it's more like there's very strict rules for how they can interact with the higher castes. It's very detailed, it's very complicated. Even now, I don't understand it. I only was able to get an introduction to it. And I know how polarizing it was, because the first time I read this book, I had a roommate who was Indian at university. And when I mentioned the fact that I was reading this book to her, she really got upset and was very critical of the book. And so only then I realized Arundhati Roy is a very controversial person. She's Hindu as well, and she writes very critically of certain aspects of Hindu culture. And for that reason, she is extremely polarizing in India. She's extremely political as well in her writing. And you can definitely see that in this book because it's set in Kerala. And Kerala is a very different place politically from the rest of India for historical reasons. So she really does not shy away from getting into all of this. Like, Kerala has a very unique sort of communist / very leftist political aspect of the way that their political makeup, let's say.
Okay.
And that also plays a huge role in this book because it's set between the 1960s and the 1990s, and it goes back and forth between these periods. And it's very, actually, the more I've talked about this book so many times, every time I discuss it, I am always amazed by just how much she was able to fit into such a small book. At the heart of everything, though, is this family. The way that their lives end up and things happen to them is really a reflection. I think what she's meant to do is to take this family and use this family to represent certain social issues in India and political issues in India. And she does it in such a masterful way that everyone who reads it feels very strongly about it one way or another, let's just say. Even me, like I really enjoyed this book, but there were some parts of it that were extremely troubling and disturbing, and I don't necessarily know if I enjoyed or wanted to see that. But it's very poetically written, it's unique in its style, and yeah, it gave me this really interesting, illuminating slice of Indian culture and history and family dynamics that I never would have been able to get without reading this book.
Personal rating?
Personal rating, I'll give it a 4 out of 5. See, I'm very generous with my ratings.
Yeah,
but you know what?
mashallah.
Already this book is a list of my favorites, so they're always going to have quite high ratings, I think.
Okay.
The reason why I docked 1 star is because of one particular plot twist that happens towards the end of the book that I think is unforgivable. But
Okay.
I won't tell you.
Is it a spoiler?
It's a spoiler, and it's
okay.
definitely not appropriate for the radio. In fact, we talked about it once before, and you cut it out of a previous episode because it's
Did I?
so inappropriate.
Okay.
No, justifiably so. Like, it
Okay,
should
I'm-
never be. The next stop is the United States of America.
America.
The 5 Wounds by Kirsten Valdez Quaid. The 5 Wounds refers to the 5 wounds that Jesus Christ received during the crucifixion. Well, this is what's interesting about this book. So most of the books that I've read, or even movies that I've consumed from the US, tend to center around like the East or West Coast.
Yeah.
So much so that like I've never been to New York or Los Angeles, but I feel like if I did go, I wouldn't feel too unfamiliar there. That's how common, books set in those places are.
Yeah.
But this book is different. This book is set in a fictional town of Las Peñas in New Mexico. And it follows the story of a Mexican-American family called the Padilla family. And they're a deeply religious Catholic family. They're very complicated as well because, well, let's start with the main characters. Amadeo is a 33-year-old man, Amadeo Padilla, who struggles with alcoholism. And at the age of 33, he already has a teenage daughter, Angel, who finds herself pregnant and is struggling to get her high school qualifications before she has the baby, or like is determined to get herself out of this vicious cycle of poverty, essentially, that her family is in.
So that probably means that they got her when they were teenagers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. As well, it follows the lives of the sort of matriarch of the family, whose name is Yolanda, who really holds everything together, holds the family together, and also starts to experience her own struggles, which I can't remember if it's a spoiler or not. I just won't mention it, but she goes through major struggles as well. The father, Amadeo, whose name actually means beloved by God, is chosen in his small town. They have a local monastery. The monastery, every year they stage this annual play / reenactment of the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, and it's actually fully reenacted. Like the person who plays Jesus Christ, they actually nail his hands to the cross, which is like
Whoa.
shocking to hear.
Yeah.
But you go with it, kind of, you know. And Amadeo is selected to play Jesus Christ in that particular year. And he views this as a sort of moment of redemption for him, like to erase his sins of the past and look forward to the future. The theme of crucifixion, or the topic of crucifixion, in other words, suffering for redemption, is constant throughout the book. And it's actually based on a short story with the same name that the author Kirsten Valdez-Quaid wrote in a previous book and decided to expand into this novel because she felt so drawn to the story and the plot and the characters. What I really loved about this book is that, it took me to a place in the United States that I never would have normally seen from movies and popular mainstream stuff. Funny story, actually. This book was actually written by my ex-boss's niece. This is very random.
Way.
Yeah. And that's how I even found out about her. Like, it's really sad to me that I probably wouldn't have heard of this book, even with all of the book news that I follow. I maybe wouldn't have heard of it until, and probably I have no doubt that she's going to have an impressive career. This book has already been nominated for and won many awards.
Wow.
But yeah, I found out about her through my ex-boss. She knew how much I love books. So she gave me the collection of short stories. It's an amazing, but it's funny because the story is very tragic in a lot of ways, but it's balanced by a lot of lighthearted moments and funny moments and quirky moments. So when you put it all together, it's actually in a way almost uplifting, which is crazy because a lot of the things that they discuss, are like, things like teenage pregnancy, a lot of stuff about drug abuse and addiction. There's heavy topics like difficult mother-daughter relationships, father-daughter relationships, and generational trauma, A lot of that is featured in this book.
Nice.
But as I said, she treats it with so much compassion and so much humanity that it ends up being uplifting towards the end. So I definitely would recommend this book to people who want to read something other than the typical mainstream American novel. This is, I feel, a huge part of American society, which is the Mexican community, for example, and the lower economic class of the country. They're extremely underrepresented, I think, in literature. I definitely would give this one 5 stars. That was The 5 Wounds by Kirsten Valdez-Quaid. Last stop is Chile, South America. Yes. Now we're going truly around the world. The book is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende. So magical realism is the main sort of theme of this, no, not theme, but the main structure of this novel. And
what is that again?
Magical realism.
What's that?
It was a very big part of my reading life while I was growing up, and it's a style of writing that was very popularized in Latin America by people like Isabel Allende and other writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez and many more. Magical realism is essentially what you would describe as literary fiction, so just following real lives of real people. But then there's like a little bit of dash of fantasy or something fantastical thrown in.
I like that.
Yes.
You see, I'm not a fan of sci-fi. However, I like sci-fi that's grounded in reality. So like something realistic, but there's an element that's off.
Yes.
Or like sci-fi.
Well, that just perfectly describes magical realism, I think.
I never knew it had a word.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a fan of magical realism.
No, definitely. And there are great examples. It's not the only place in the world, but Latin America is heavily influenced by magical realism.
Okay.
And there's a lot of this. I think if you take this concept, you can actually see it in many other. It's a very common feature of a lot of African literature as well. And some parts of Europe and definitely within the Arab world as well. Okay. So it's a global thing and it's fantastic. I love it. But when I was younger, I sort of became fixated on Latin American magical realism. And Isabel Allende, I think, was the first way I got introduced to it. And basically this book, The House of the Spirits, is it's definitely a modern masterpiece. It's taught in schools all over the world. And that's how I found out about it. My cousin was assigned this book in her 12th grade English class, and she had it sitting in her room, and me, being the bookworm that I am, was just desperate to read anything. So I took her book, I read it, and I completely fell in love with it. And it's very interesting also because Isabel Allende herself is a really interesting person from a very interesting family. She came from a very politically exposed family in Chile. Her father was a very important political figure, and her uncle as well. So a lot of that informed the way she created. And actually, when she wrote this story, she was living in exile, I think, in the United States. And it follows this family called the Trueba family, starting with what would then become the patriarch of the family, Esteban, all the way down to his granddaughter, Alba. And it goes across many decades, many generations, and many members of the family. There's a huge cast of characters here. And the story is actually incredibly dramatic. It starts off with Esteban trying to create this dynasty, you know? And so they come up from not nothing, but they basically move up the ranks, like socioeconomically. And so many things happen. He ends up getting married to the sister of the woman that he originally wanted to marry. Her name is Clara. She's clairvoyant and telekinetic. So that's the magical realism.
What?
So she can predict things in the future and she can move things with her mind.
What's the word for predicting things?
Clairvoyant.
Clairvoyant?
Yes.
That's a new one for me.
Yeah, clairvoyant.
Okay.
You learn something new here every day.
Yeah. Paper cut club, baby.
And I have never read, I have never watched South American telenovelas, but I imagine that this feels like a literary version of that.
You really?
Because it's got like really dramatic scenes, lots of dramatic relationships. There's affairs.
But there's no dramatic zoom-ins of the camera.
You never know. I think this was also probably turned into a movie, but it was. I can imagine.
Maria Isabel.
Exactly. Like, it's got the best and worst of humanity, like, shown on the page, and in a very dramatic way, which I feel is what a telenovela is.
Okay.
Based on my one, like, adjacent experience of watching.
Really? That's only one?
I've only watched one thing, which is close to a telenovela, which is called, what is it called? Jane the Virgin. Have you seen it?
No.
It's American.
That doesn't count. I'm sorry. Listen, I grew up, I don't know if you remember this. I'm surprised you've not seen more, but once upon a time, we didn't have that many stations on TV, and they used to play a lot of telenovelas.
Really?
A lot, but they were dubbed in Arabic. So you had, what were their names?
Oh my God, I have unlocked something in my memory. Yes,
it was huge back then. This was before Turkish shows became a thing. Back then it was, I think, mainly Mexican,
yeah,
and they were all dubbed in Arabic, so they would speak like this.
It's funny because
Mother.
the Arabic voice matches the dramatic Mexican voice.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
okay.
I wish I can remember some names. It's killing me that I can't. Do you remember any Mexican old school?
Rosalinda,
Yeah, Rosalinda. Oh my God, she remembers them. Yes. Yeah.
I'm just Googling it now. I've never seen this.
Maria Isabel.
Maria Mercedes.
Oh.
Maria Mercedes.
That actually sounds familiar to me. But that's probably the name of like 70 women.
Yeah, that's a lot of
70 different
people.
shows.
A lot of people's names are Maria Mercedes.
Oh, I did watch one soap opera called Passions, which was basically inspired by telenovela.
No, yours are not the legit ones. So I must say, yours.
Everything
they're
I
not
watch is
legit.
so derivative of telenovelas.
No. If it's not Maria Mercedes, it's not.
It doesn't count. Okay, fine. I need to get into this world. Don't
Good
get
drama.
offended, but when I leave, I'm gonna have to slam the door on the way out.
Okay.
And storm out.
I expect nothing less.
Yes.
Good luck with that massive metal door. Slamming that door.
As I mentioned, Allende was using the family to express her opinions on politics and society and a very specific pivotal moment in Chile's history. And it really is a modern masterpiece. I think she treats everything in such a graceful way, and I need to reread this book because it's been quite a few years, and I think I'm gonna get something totally different out of it now. Probably when I was reading it, I think I related so much to Alba, the granddaughter. But I think if I read it now, I'll probably relate to other characters just because I'm older and stuff, you know?
Okay.
But
What do you remember your personal rating to be?
I remember my personal rating to be 5 out of 5 for this.
Ooh.
This was extremely important in my reading development, and it changed a lot of the way that I consume books. Yeah, for sure. So
book?
5 out of 5. And that is The House of the Spirits by Isabel Allende.
Yeah, I feel like my exam is coming up soon.
Yeah,
It's like, what do they have in common? I've been trying to figure that out. They have families.
they have families. I feel like I was trying to refer to it subtly throughout.
Yeah, I don't know. I had assumptions earlier, and then it's like, no.
What are your assumptions?
It's like someone leaves and goes to another place, but then that's not in common with the rest of the story.
True.
But I don't have a good theory.
Well, this is maybe my own interpretation, but I feel like all of these books use the family, so you get an idea of this particular family. But
Wait.
tell me.
Khalas, I know where you're going. Okay. It's about a family, but it's really about the culture. Is that the thing?
And the country.
And the country.
Yes.
I'm genius.
Well done. Let's just cut out the part where I started answering the question.
Yeah, just cut it out. No one needs to know.
And it's always like that. I feel like they use the small to represent the big and the micro to reflect the macro.
Yeah.
And I love that combination, that polarity, you know. And whenever people try to write about such big topics, using the big topics themselves, like politics, blah, 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 it's too heavy and it's too difficult for people to absorb and understand.
Yeah.
Whereas if you translate it into a family, this immediately becomes relatable to people.
I even love movies that do that. It's like the main story is about a person, or in your case, a family. But in the process of going through their lives, you're learning about the broader society that they live in, and you get real insight, like real information of what it's like living in a certain culture or country.
You know, I repeat this probably on every episode, but, you know, through these 5 fiction novels, I was able to learn about aspects of the history of these countries that I never would have picked up by reading a book actually about the history of those countries.
Right.
Like I just have very vivid and graphic details that make it personal as well. It's not just like, oh, in Kerala, you know, the Communist Party took over in the 1950s. Okay, but now I know really what happened, why it happened, all the dynamics that led to this, the popularity of this political party, blah, 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 and that's one of the reasons why I get really miffed. It's one of my pet peeves when people say that you don't learn anything from reading, or it's a waste of time from reading fiction.
Right.
That was my tour around the world through 5 families.
That was super fun.
Yeah, it was. I had so many more that I wanted to include, but obviously we're limited in time, and I wanted to go a little bit deeper into each story a little bit. But I don't know, if people like this and are interested in hearing more, I'd be more than happy to do another episode that's similar. And I'm really curious to hear about what my audience thinks of when they think about family sagas. Like, do you guys have any particular family sagas that you find are worth reading, worth telling about?
Where can they reach you?
You can reach me on Instagram at thepapercut.club. I never really mentioned this, but I also have a Facebook page. If you're on Facebook, you can find me there at the Papercut Club. Let me know what family sagas you're drawn to and what you'd like to recommend, and maybe it'll be featured in the next episode on family sagas. Thank you, Abdullah. Can you hit me with a motivational quote so we can end
of course.
a high note?
One second. Done is better than perfect.
That's it? That's a quote?
Yep.
Well, that's a perfect way to end this episode, actually.
Is it?
Done is better than perfect.
We're
yes,
done.
We're done. The Papercut Club is a member of the Oman FM podcast collective. You can find all of Oman FM's latest shows and updates on Instagram at omanfm.om. This episode was hosted by me, Fatma Makki, and edited and mixed by Abdullah Al Maawali. You can follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook at thepapercut.club, or you can visit our website at www.thepapercut.club. Rate us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcast. Maybe leave a little review.
Can I just say seriously, guys, if you're a fan of Fatma Makki and the Papercut Club, leaving a comment on Apple Podcasts and a rating really helps reach a larger audience. So, show
Yes.
some love. Do that.
Thank you. It's hard for me to self-promote.
I got you.
Thank you for
I got
doing
you.
that for me.
And we out.
Paper Cut Club on Oman FM.